Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today on Friday afternoon. We have Rachel Moran joining us all the way from Dublin, Ireland, and she is a journalist, she's an author, and she wrote the book Paid For: My Journey Through Prostitution. I'm going to start off by reading her bio, and then we'll hand it over to her. I'm going to do some Q&A with her based on the book, and then we are going to open it up to the audience to put their Q&A in the Q&A box, and then we will have plenty of time for discussion. So thank you, Rachel, for joining us today. I'm so excited. It's not often that we get to read a book and have the privilege of actually asking the author these questions. So with that, as I mentioned, Rachel is a journalist. She's a women's rights campaigner and author of the best-selling book Paid For, and which has been endorsed by Jane Fonda, U.S. President Jimmy Carter, Gloria Steinem, Robin Morgan, and many others. It has been published in 14 countries and numerous languages, including German, Italian, Korean, and French. She was prostituted for 7 years in Dublin and across Ireland, beginning when she was 15 years old. She later completed her education and received a degree in journalism from Dublin City University and a master's in creative writing from University College Dublin. She first addressed the issue of prostitution publicly in February of 2011 when she spoke to a crowd gathered in Dublin to discuss implementing the equality model in Ireland. She has since spoken at the United Nations, the European Parliament, Westminster Parliament, Harvard, Columbia, and many other global institutions and prominent places of learning. Today, she is completing her first work of fiction, which has been agented, and she coaches people to write their memoirs at writeyourmemoir.com. So once again, thank you for joining us today, Rachel. We appreciate you taking your time out of your busy schedule to be with us here today. And for me, even though I'm involved with this work as program director for the Alliance to End Human Trafficking, this book was eye-opening. Some of the things I was already aware of, some were new to me. So I think we can always learn. I think everyone should read this book because you do really a tremendous job of giving us a view of what is involved with prostitution, right? And for those who may have grown up watching Pretty Woman and so forth, your book describes a very much different perspective. And I'd like to just start off with this quote by Richard Holloway from Godless Morality, because this was in the beginning of your book and I just loved it. What makes the simple act of shaming or blaming people complicated is the knowledge that each had a specific history. And the more we know about it, the easier it becomes to understand why they did what they did. So I just thought that was such a tremendous quote because I do try to apply that in my everyday life. And if you could just please share a little bit more about how we can allow grace for others instead of passing judgment, and trying to understand the stories, because that's one of the points or the main points that you make in your book is how prostitutes are judged by society. Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, I'll try. And thanks so much for having me, Christine. I loved that quote too. I really did, because it was impactful in a way that caused me to think about other people and their histories and stories too. Um, and I think the more time and distance that I've put between myself and the sex trade, the more that I've come to kind of pull back the lens, if you know what I mean, and take a broader look at what's going on socially, for all of the different parties involved, the police, the punters, as we call them over here. I know you call them the Johns in the States. Um,
Mhm.
I didn't need to get an education from anywhere and what was going on for the girls, because I'd lived that and I'd witnessed it. But over time, you really think more deeply about what's going on all the way around. I read a book a few years ago. I think it was called Pimp. I couldn't swear to you that that was the title. It's a pity now I didn't think of it ahead of our conversation. But I'll send it on to you afterwards. And it was a story about an American man who'd ended up pimping in his adulthood. And he came from such a broken history. There was all sorts of abuse, sexual abuse, physical abuse, loss, grief, bereavement in his early life. And I don't want it to be taken to mean that I'm trying to make any excuses for people who, um, you know, make a career out of abusing and exploiting other people. But it's interesting and important, I think, to look at the sex trade in a holistic way, and to look at how harm and damage is at the root of all of the actions of all of the actors involved. So that's what I take from that quote from Godless Morality.
Mm. Yeah, and that's not the first time I've heard that. So we don't, we often condemn the pimps and the Johns and the buyers, and of course, but that's a great point, because studies have shown that oftentimes the pimps and the people who end up being trafficked or prostituted have very similar upbringings. Have become from abusive homes, um, and they both had similar backstories, but where the women often end up getting exploited, the men end up going the other way and becoming the exploiters.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but yeah, we don't really know their stories. Um, so one thing that you mentioned in your book was also listening to your inner voice that brought you peace to write under your own name and not wear a mask. And I feel that so many people today wear masks, right? I mean, you could even talk about the masks of the traffickers, right? And they may be putting on this tough bravado, but deep down underneath, there was a lot of hurt and pain, like you said, maybe growing up. Um, how did choosing to go by your real name instead of a pseudonym, because I know you struggled that with a little bit, had helped shed that mask for you?
Well, for me, it was never that I was wearing a mask to begin with, so I didn't need to shed one. Um, but stepping out in public with my own name was very important on all sorts of levels. Um, I mean, there were practical things that I couldn't even have seen coming at the time when I was wrestling with that decision. Um, what it was for me at a soul level, and I'll have to excuse myself here, by the way, Christine, because I have the heaviest head cold I've had in a long time. So if anybody is listening to me who's heard me speak before, they'll hear that. I have a woeful cold. I am sorry. Um, but yeah, I needed to speak in public because this was such a very important truth to tell, that you had to nail your colors to the mast, and you couldn't do that incognito. That was my, just very firm conviction there, and I know that I was right. What I didn't know and what I didn't see coming at that time when I was wrestling with that decision was that um had I spoken out using a pseudonym, I never would have been believed. I knew back then that I would have been doubted, but I didn't realize that I never would have been believed. Because even speaking out in my own name and telling the full truth in the full public view, it was still contended for about 8 years straight that I was a fraud and a fantasist and basically a liar. And people said that about me from I first opened my mouth until I finally won a defamation case to shut those rumors down in November of 2019. So that was most of the last decade. So that's another reason why I was very fortunate to have made the decision to speak out in my own name. Um, because that put me in a position where I could walk into a courtroom with affidavits from the vice squad officer who arrested me and the foster mother who took me into her home after my arrest, and I could clear my name basically, but only because I'd used my name in the first place.
Yeah, and I think that took a lot of bravery and courage, and I just want to commend you for that, because I don't think we would be here today if you wrote it under a pseudonym. So and I think society sometimes hears some of these stories, and sometimes they're so horrific they either can't or don't want to believe it's true, right? Um, One of the things I want to touch on, like in chapter 5, you talk about homelessness. So that's basically kind of what led you to your situation. So there's an excerpt where you write that running away can be an attempt to make a positive move, a means of breaking away from an intolerable home life in order to make a fresh start. It can also be seen as an attempt to exercise control over the situation. However, while a young woman may be making an attempt to be assertive, she would simultaneously be increasing her vulnerability to manipulation. And then you also mentioned that a huge proportion of adult prostitutes were like you. They were not adults to begin with. They to have been able to consent to this. So I know you don't really use the term human trafficking um, in your book, but can you talk about vulnerabilities? Because here in the United States, if you're under the age of 18 and you're being bought and sold for sex, you're automatically considered a victim of human trafficking. And I know there's a reason why you didn't use that terminology, but I want to talk about some of the vulnerabilities that our youth may experience that can lead to further exploitation by traffickers who are targeting runaways or people who are desperate, which can then lead to a lifestyle or a lifetime of prostitution.
Um, well, excuse me, there's a whole plethora of vulnerabilities, and from my personal bird's eye view back in the early 90s, what I found when I first went out onto the streets was that I was running into girls my own age, quite regularly who I knew from the foster care, from the care system, which covered multiple different layers. There was foster care, there was residential care, in various different residential care settings. So I'd know this girl from here and that girl from there, and sometimes I'd know a girl because she was a friend of a friend who I'd known in residential care. And if I could say anything about that whole system, I really think that residential care ought to be done away with. I think that foster care, and obviously properly run, properly managed foster care ought to be the only way that young boys and girls are dealt with when they're forced to leave home or taken into care. Um, because in my experience, residential care was like a training ground, really, in all sorts of things that you really ought not to be learning at that age. Um, how to develop addictions being the very first of them. Um, but anyway, those vulnerabilities came about through what we had already experienced before we ever got into the care system. There was abuse of all kinds, very often sexual. Um, my parents were both mentally unwell. So in our home, although it was a loving home from the point of view that our parents did love us, I've never doubted that for a moment, but they were just too unwell to take on the task of parenthood. it's a huge task for the wellest among us, you know, and they were just too unwell to do that with 5 children, you know, just it was too big a hill to climb. Um, so there was inevitably a lot of neglect, and there was a lot of emotional and psychological harm. And I think what that really speaks to is that you can come from a background where there's no sexual abuse whatsoever in the home and still be rendered really, really vulnerable. And that's as true for boys as it is for girls. When it comes to the sex trade and sexual exploitation, I mean, obviously we know that the vast majority of people in the sex trade are women and girls. This we know. Um, but also, you know, I saw a lot of very vulnerable young boys out on the streets and in care homes. Um, and I think in some ways their vulnerabilities were similar and in other ways different. But we were all vulnerable in one way, shape, or form. Um, and so yeah, that's how that manifested. In a nutshell, it starts in the home.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk a little bit about, you mentioned in chapter 7 that there's no happy hookers in your experience. So how would you address those comments? So we see how vulnerabilities can lead people into the streets, homelessness, and out of desperation, into prostitution or selling themselves, for boys. Sometimes it's survival sex, as well as girls and women. So how would you address comments from those who are in this industry who advocate that they're choosing this lifestyle?
Well, I would say if you're in a position to choose this lifestyle, well, for you, that's not the case for 99.9% of women and girls on this earth, you know? And I wonder what other area of life we take a tiny, tiny fragment and hold them up as representative. I have not seen that happen anywhere else. It's just a nonsense argument from the start. Um, you know, there's a lot of different ways to answer that question. I find it a kind of there's always a despicable kind of edge of that attitude that I pick up and that really grates on me when people start talking about how, for example, they get to choose. And giving you the example of just one woman, I could give you scores of them. Um, People I have met down the years, and usually in the context of social media, I don't mean face to face, but I've had scores of people now say to me, I get to choose, and I choose who I please, and it's like they're talking about some form of prostitution that after 7 years I had never heard of it, that somehow managed to slip by me. It somehow managed to slip by the hundreds of women I've worked with collaboratively in my campaigning the last 14 years. Um, I remember when I was blogging, I wrote a blog titled "Where Were All the Happy Hookers When I Was on the Game?" Because I was so annoyed, and this was back in 2012. I was so annoyed hearing about this, a mythical corner of the sex trade that I'd somehow never managed to discover. Um, but I do know of at least one woman who heads up a very well funded so-called sex workers charity, government funded charity, um, from which she draws a very hefty salary. And she does get to choose because she's on a six-figure salary, and she can see her few, clients as she would think of them, regulars from one end of the year to the other. Um, and I think that holding a woman in those circumstances up as representative of the masses in the sex trade is just absolutely despicable.
Right. And you'll hear that even the ones who are saying they're choosing this lifestyle have still experienced some type of sexual abuse growing up, and so forth. So yeah, there's, definitely more to it than we realize. Um, So I think that kind of leads into our next question. If you could elaborate a little bit more about one of the things our organization supports is called the equality model or the Nordic model. It's been called lots of different things, Swedish model. Just yesterday, I heard another organization is calling it the survivors model. Um, can you share a little bit about why you support that model and what's the reasoning behind that?
Well, I think it matters a lot less what you call it than that it's implemented properly. I
Mhm.
think it's an absolute disaster if this model is implemented in only some of its components, because they all work together, and you've got to either implement all of them or leave it alone. Um, so, and I'm not suggesting that we should leave the sex trade alone to run out of all control. What I'm saying is that we need to implement this model properly and fully. Because what it aims to do is to first of all give women other options, also to criminalize the male demand, and it is male demand, for sexual access to female bodies, to all bodies, of course. Um, and to implement then the laws that they are already in place in most places anyway, against traffickers and against pimps, unless of course we're talking about somewhere like Germany or Holland where you've got industrial scale prostitution. Um, and the thing is, I bring this back to personal experience in my own head, and that's, the politics and the personal experience are kind of touchstones for each other in the way that I think. And I know that when I was in the sex trade, what I needed was support. I didn't have what I needed to keep me out of the sex trade, but at the point that I entered at 15 years old, anywhere between there and 22 when I got out, I didn't need anybody telling me that I deserved better, or any of this nonsense. I mean, I knew that. Women in prostitution know that. What I needed was a strategy. I needed financial support. I needed a roof over my head that I wasn't getting from any other way. I needed education and training. At various points during those 7 years, my needs changed. Because there came a time when I needed therapy. There came a time when I needed addiction services, because by the time I got about halfway through prostitution, I was woefully addicted to narcotics. And this is the sad thing, is that as the years roll by, I mean, that slice of my life was only 15 to 22. But there was so much damage done. And it was like a kind of a carnival carousal, like you were in a different position every 6 months. A lot of the women are mothers, so they will have a different set of needs, an additional set of needs. Um, so what I'm saying is that we need a multiplicity of services delivered in a holistic wraparound kind of a package. And that's what women need to get out of the sex trade. Like, there is no point in criminalizing the only source of income that they have if you're not going to help them get out. And I've said that everywhere I've gone for years and years and years. Um, and I think it's a very, very important piece. We can't afford to miss that.
Yeah, and I think one of the challenges that women may face coming out of prostitution or out of human trafficking and so forth is the fact that they have arrest records, and it could be due to drugs or crimes that their traffickers or pimp forced them to, or just being arrested as a result of prostitution. And so the equality or the Nordic model kind of addresses that, right? So you have partial decriminalization where you're holding the pimps and the Johns, or as you call them, the punters, accountable, but you're not arresting the people who are being prostituted. So I think that's definitely an important component as well. So they don't get stuck in those cycles where, you know, you it's hard to get housing, it's hard to get a job, once you have a criminal record. So that's, I think, so important as well. Um, One of the things that I found eye-opening, in chapter 17, you talk about the myth of prostitutes' control, as well as escort services versus street prostitution. And I believe our society as a whole has a higher view of escort services, as in they're a higher grade of prostitution or have more control over their circumstances. But you actually describe the opposite in your book. And in fact, not only are the clientele not of a higher grade, but rather you mentioned that they're more abusive than street prostitution. Can you share a little bit more about this as well?
Well, that was my experience, and I'm not claiming it was universal because I have met
Mhm.
women who've had experiences of just wall to wall to wall appalling violence and street prostitution. But my main point was that when you are in street prostitution, you have the ability to use all of your faculties. So, and I've made this point numerous times now in public, but if you're looking at somebody, you meet somebody face to face on the street corner, you can see the look in their eyes. Are you sensing aggression in their expression? Um, if somebody has an intention to go out and hurt a woman and goes out with that intention, if a man has that on his mind and you happen to be the woman that he meets, you will sense that in a lot of cases. And it could be the slightest thing, you mightn't even be able to put your finger on it, but all of your senses are working in tandem. You can sense his demeanor, what way is he holding or carrying his physical self. Um, what way is he looking at you? What kind of look has he got in his eye? Has he got booze on his breath? So you can smell that, you can see that, you can sense that. But when you're making bookings for yourself down a phone line, your senses are reduced down to one, and that's just what you can hear. What's going on with his tone of voice. That's all you're left with, you know. And I found that was um that was a disaster in my life. And I didn't go indoors because I wanted to or had any intention of doing that. I went indoors because of the Sexual Offences Act of 1993. It came into effect in November of that year. I'll never forget that because we were all getting dragged off the streets. It was very heavily enforced. Um, yeah, it was horrible, and we had no choice, most of us, but to go indoors.
Yeah, and so there's a reason why they call it street smarts, right? And I'm sure you became very adept at reading people. We see so much in human trafficking today. So much of it's happening online, and so these women and girls are being bought and sold online, and they don't have a choice. They don't get to meet who, they're just sent to a hotel room,
Mhm.
or the John or the buyers coming to their place of business, and they don't get to make those choices. But one of the things I love that you shared in your book was that in some ways you did have a choice on with as far as regards as to the buyers. So you shared the story about the father who takes his son to lose his virginity and you refuse his request. And I just love that you did that, because you're setting an example for his son when the father should have been. So, what role should parents, especially fathers, um, what role do they play on how men should treat women? What role do they play in breaking those cycles of toxic masculinity and viewing women as sexual objects?
Well, you can answer that at great length. I think the reality, Christine, is that the world we're living in, the whole world we're living in has become so intensely, incredibly toxic. I'm in my late 40s now. I'm 48 years of age. I got out of prostitution at 22, as you know, so I've actually been alive longer than I was, when I get out of the sex trade. And what I've seen in that time is just this, and of course it's very, very much to do with the internet and with social media. Um, but as far as human sexuality is concerned, and the sense of connection and the sense of loving and the sense of honoring each other's physical and sexual selves, that concept is rapidly heading towards the gutter, you know. And this is a question that I would actually prefer to sit down and write like a 5,000 word article in response to, because it's too deep for sound bites. Um, because I don't just think it is just about what fathers can do, although that's hugely important. Um, but I think it's also about what mothers can do and what people more generally can do in terms of calling out what we're seeing all around us. Because it's too ugly and it's too pervasive and it's everywhere you go all the time. Um, I mean, even if you didn't have an internet connection, it's the culture now is so steeped in these toxic ways of interacting that you just couldn't escape it. I always think that getting into the schools is really important. Um, I think we ought to be setting up programs to teach children. I mean, we talk a lot about, sex ed and all of that, and there's very, very little conversation that I have ever heard about the power of human sexuality and how it can be used for good or ill, how it can be um misused to the point of evil, or how it can exist in exactly that opposite. I don't think we understand human sexuality. Honestly, I think sometimes it's kind of like almost as if it was a toy designed for a much older child. I think that that's the way we treat ourselves and each other in society. It's a huge issue. It's a huge area of discussion. Um, as for fathers, I think his son will end up inevitably learning whatever it is that his father shows him. So my advice to fathers would be to worry a lot less about what you say to him and worry more about what you're showing him.
Yeah, great point. Um, I want to at this time open it up for questions. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to put it in the Q&A. We encourage you to type anything that you have regarding the book, or, if you're joining us and haven't read the book as of yet, and you have just any general questions, we welcome that as well. So while people are typing in their questions, I do want to talk about uh, a little bit about the women and girls that you referenced, that prostitutes are often young women and girls, because, and I think this is such a great point, and this goes to those vulnerabilities, that they usually don't have any other viable options, right? Like, people say, oh, well, you always have a choice, right? But when you're too young to work or qualify for unemployment, you know, as you mentioned in your book, what options do they really have, right? And so, what solutions would you like to see people to, or our government or organizations or what have you? What would you like to see to address this issue? How can we address this issue? What can be done?
When I look
When I
back
look back,
what I see is that I fell through every crack there was in the system. Um, People say you already you know you always have a choice. Well, first of all, it's illegal to employ a 15-year-old child in this country. Um, and also you're too young at that age to claim social welfare. So if you are not been taken care of by your parents or any other family member or by the state in whatever way that might manifest, residential, foster care, whatever, and you're living on your own wits and you've nothing else to live on. I'd like to know what alternatives are people suggesting. Is a young girl or boy in those circumstances supposed to do what exactly? You know, um, are you supposed to break into people's houses? Are you supposed to go shoplifting every day? Like, what are the things that people are suggesting are better options for that individual and for society? My thought process around all of this, of course, is that we ought to be supporting young people in those circumstances so that it doesn't come to that in the first place. And we also ought to be implementing Nordic model style policies. Um, that and a very important part of this, by the way, that's not discussed often enough, is the social impact that it has. Because prostitution in Sweden plummeted after the implementation of the Swedish model there. Um, you know, and there were lots of conversations conducted with youth, Swedish youth, that I found really interesting. Young men, like 19 to 22, that age group. Um, and I mean, you think about how little sense young men of that age group usually have on any matters. But they had very, very quickly picked up the idea that this was not cool, that you were a loser, that there was something wrong with you, that if you needed to pay for sex, like what was your problem? So I mean, there's an argument to be made about whether legislation is downstream of culture or whether culture is downstream of legislation. I think it can be both. And certainly in Sweden, we saw solid evidence that culture was downstream of legislation.
Yeah, I've heard that, and when I read about that, I loved it. It was a whole different mindset, right?
Mm.
Sometimes we see the mindset here like, oh, yeah, I'm going to take my son to the strip club for his 18th birthday because it's a rite of passage, and what message is that sending him? Or like you mentioned, the father, who was, trying to buy his son sex. And so I love the fact that it's kind of putting the onus back on men, like, okay, if you can't get a woman, what's wrong with you? you know
Mm.
and you know I I don't know how we change that cultural mindset, across the board, but yeah, it does maybe begin with legislation and our leaders. And that's such an important point. And it's like we also mentioned, standing up, speaking up, either as women and or as men on these cultural things, which is not always easy to do. But we have a few questions, and so I do want to get to those. Um, so we do have one question that has, what age of school children do you suggest best to speak to? We've been to high schools and we're told we need to get to middle schools, which we did, but it's hard for one person to get to so many schools. So
Can you
what
just
age do
remind
you
me? Because,
recommend?
well, we have a different school system over here, so I need to know what age group are in your
Oh, sure, yeah. So middle school would be sixth through eighth grade. So I would say that typically around ages 11, 12, 13, 14 is typically when high school begins. So 14 through 18 would be more typical high school. So that's ninth, 10th, 11th, and 12th grades.
Yeah, yeah, you need to get into the middle schools. You really do. It's a horrible thing to have to say that, but this is the world we're living in. It would be really nice if we could wait until our youth are 14 and 15 before we have these discussions, but it's too late by then. And there are so many factors out there that make this a reality now, especially the wall-to-wall grooming that's going on online. We need to be talking with young kids. I mean, I would say gentle kind of conversations, but alerting them to dangers, I would say from 10 years old. Um, I mean, it would be fantastic if every parent in America collectively agreed not to give their kids a device until they were, whatever, 12, or so that you could know when the exact right time was. But that's not the world we're living in. I think you do need to get into the middle schools, and of course, your conversations need to be age appropriate. But I do
Yeah.
think it's too late to wait to the 14, 15 age group. It's first of all, our thoughts and ideas have formed too solidly, and socio-cultural levels at that point. Um, Boys need to really, really know that this is not only not okay, but reflects very poorly on them. But there's a whole raft of work to be done aside from that and around that culturally. I mean, I know that there's been a campaign for a long time now to shut down Pornhub, for example. I think that that's absolutely crucial. It couldn't be more important. Um, Collapsing these platforms that are basically rape factories. As long as we are tolerating that, we can't educate our way out of this.
Yeah, and I think, I would say there's even a way to address this issue even on the elementary school level. I mean, you don't have to go into the elementary schools talking about prostitution and human trafficking, but when we talk about some of these vulnerabilities like sexual abuse and so forth, teaching the kids at an early age what is safe touch, what is okay for, um,
Your
where
body is
people
your
can
own,
touch you and
those sort of, yeah. Oh, absolutely. I mean, that kind of message and instilling in young children the idea that their physical selves belong to themselves, like that kind of messaging. Absolutely. I'm talking about the more when you're heading into the more getting real with kids about what the potential dangers and the consequences, that sort of stuff. I would get in there at middle school for those conversations.
absolutely, definitely. So we have another question. Someone had asked, you say your sense of self was lost when you were in prostitution. How difficult is it for women to regain themselves after leaving prostitution? And I think we talked about this at our earlier meeting as well, because you mentioned a couple women who seem to have lost themselves. And, and we talked about like, what is it that you were able to in this person's terminology, regain themselves or not totally lose yourself within this realm.
Um, I from what I remember having written in my memoir, I never described having lost myself entirely and utterly.
Hmm.
What I felt was that I lost touch with myself. Um, that the deepest bedrock of who I am as a human being was obscured to me. It was very far away from me. Um, I didn't feel that I'd lost myself entirely, but that there had been a kind of a severance, like um, because who you really are can't coexist forever alongside of that kind of abuse. It does a daily damage. And by the time you've spent a good chunk of a decade, um, betraying yourself basically, and being violated so routinely, and staying still, staying physically still, staying in that space where that's been done to you, it damages your relationship with yourself very, very deeply. But I'm sorry, I've forgotten the tail end of that question. Could you repeat the end of it, please?
Sure. They were asking how difficult is it for women to kind of regain themselves after leaving prostitution? How do you get back in touch with yourself?
Well, I think an important thing to know about that, and I remember a conversation I had with a woman, a good friend of mine from Boston, about all of this. Um, the reality is that we were not broken in prostitution, although the incredible harm that it did to us, but that we took our broken selves into prostitution. So when you're dealing with a prostituted woman and she's coming out of prostitution, or she wants to, and she wants to access services and so forth, you're not just dealing with somebody who's been harmed in the sex trade. You're dealing with somebody who was harmed enough to walk into the sex trade in the first place. And sometimes that harm goes all the way back to her toddlerhood, you know. Um, I've known women who were abused from they were 2 year olds, and consistently all the way up through childhood, and ended up in prostitution by their mid-teens. So how do you unpack that? You know, you're talking about many years of therapy and support and services. And I think that this is something that the governments of the Western world simply don't want to get real about, because it would cost too much money. There's a huge amount of services necessary here to help people who have been so harmed. And they constitute a good number of women in the sex trade.
Yeah. I know even in like the state of Florida, which we're actually one of the better states when it comes to services, but there's still always like all the houses are always full. There's still, even though there's a lot of services, there's still a lack of services. And that's really what's needed um to address some of these issues, like those wraparound services. Um, I have a comment here from Mary Ann who said, "Thank you for stressing the use of prostituted individual versus prostitute. I spoke last weekend to college students regarding human trafficking, and both groups commented on my use of the term prostituted individual versus the term prostitute." And I think that was even something that um, I wasn't as aware of as I should be as well. So
And
yeah.
neither was I, Christine, when I wrote that book. Um,
Mm,
and when the French edition went out a few years ago, I actually wrote a new foreword for it, asking the readers to ignore this language if they found, where they found it here in this book or anywhere else. Because I came to understand something a few years into my activism. But my book had already been published at that point. And
mm,
it was the difference between um the term prostitute and the term prostitution. So I had this kind of dislike that I think many of us share towards the term prostitute, but I had no problem at all with the term prostitution. And
mm,
I finally got around to this through conversations with close friends in the movement, and a lot of thinking alongside of it. And the reality, as I understand it now, is that we should always use the term prostitution when we're talking about, as an interchangeable term with the sex trade.
mhm,
Never ever sex work, but prostitution, yes, I'll always leave that on the table, because that's what we're talking about. But
mhm,
the term prostitute, what that does is to identify a person as, this is what you are, that,
mhm,
like you are a prostitute.
mhm,
And then again, the term prostitute, it explains, it brings, like I said in the book, the perpetrator into the picture. I wish I'd had a little bit more time to think through those dynamics more fully before I published that book, because it's something
mhm.
that bothers me often when I read from it in public. I
Mhm.
have been across the term prostitute quite regularly. And I do know, by the way, and I think this is an important thing to point out, is that there are women in our movement who want to do away with the term prostitution because they think
Mhm.
that it will be an important step in getting rid of the term prostitute. Well,
Mhm.
I don't agree with that. I think it's a very well intended mistake. That's the way I perceive that. Um, and I look at it like in the way that I'll never use the term slave to describe um anybody's ancestors, including my own, because the Irish were also enslaved. But I will say enslaved people or enslaved person, if you're talking about an individual. But that's a different thing from getting rid of the term slavery. We should never get rid of the term slavery. But you get rid of that term and then you're erasing enormous swaths of history that should never be erased. So there's a
Mhm.
very important distinction to me between the term prostitution and the term prostitute. And I might get around sometime to laying out the complexities of those thoughts in an article. But I did want to make that point because I think it's important.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. And, we're all learning here, right? Um, and so that's why we're here. We're here to learn. And, as we go along, then we learn what's the best terminology to use and so forth. Um, I do have another question by Noreen who said, "Thank you, Rachel, for your honest and reflective responses. I would like to get your thoughts on how the demand side can be called, um, I'm not sure what she's asking, can be called and what kind of shaming process can be useful." Um, so I think she's asking about the demand side. And I think she's asking about, I guess, there's certain, like, for example, here in Florida with House Bill 851 that was passed, if you are, caught, purchasing someone, that you would be put on a website. Or in Lakeland, they do these sex trafficking sting operations, and then you get your um, picture plastered all over the news and the newspaper and all that. So I'm thinking that's kind of where she's going with that. Like, how do we address the demand side, and what do you think is effective, whether it's shaming and so forth, that can be useful for addressing the demand side?
Well, that's such an easy question to answer because the punters have told us, they've given us that information already. So in every research study that's ever been conducted with the men directly across multiple different nations, they always say that it's being found out. It's having their wives informed, it's having their workplaces informed, it's having what they've done made public. So they don't care about being fined, they don't care about being arrested, they don't care about those things on their own, the connection to those things. They care about being arrested if it causes their wife to find out, you know.
Mhm.
It's public exposure, it's exposing what it is that they've done. Um, I wouldn't be so interested in shaming as I would be in deterring, and they've already told us that this is a deterrent.
Mhm.
So I would take that very seriously for sure.
Well, so, and we have just about 5 minutes left, and we have a question from Jean, who said, and she's talking about OnlyFans. I don't know if you're familiar with OnlyFans star Lily Phillips. Apparently, she was with 100 men in a day. So, but I know OnlyFans is
I heard
another
that.
platform where, girls and women can be abused, but also sold online, or a lot of pimps moved women, off the streets and onto OnlyFans. Um, but so her question is, what do you think the impact on men and women is when the OnlyFans star Lily Phillips was with 100 men in a day?
First of all, I heard it was 1,000. Um,
Okay.
I wonder, is that the same woman? But yeah, I think it was upwards of 1,000. But anyway, well, I think it harks back to what we were talking about in the earlier part of our conversation when I was mentioning how the world is just devolving into a very sick and twisted place. Um, you know, so the question is like, what are we supposed to do about all of this? Um, there comes a point where I think what we're seeing is a merging of different, very sick things. I sometimes think in analogies, Christine. I actually see like visuals in my mind that are difficult to relay in language. Because right now, what I'm imagining is a kind of a watercolor mishmash where you have all of this um integrated sort of sickness where because OnlyFans is the public face of OnlyFans is very much driven by young women. And you do have some young women on there who are making untold crazy amounts of money. And they are, of course, being put forward as the face of OnlyFans because they need to keep that, the shareholders in there need to keep the whole OnlyFans wheel turning. So they need new, fresh meat all the time. And I'm sorry to be so graphic, but this is the way that they're perceived, and it's the way that they're treated. Um, and in order to advertise that as a very, very lucrative regular paycheck, they need to have young women who are like 19, 21, 23 years old talking about what a fabulous lifestyle they're living on account of their OnlyFans business model. You know, so what do you do about that? I think I would bring down Pornhub first if I were involved in um anti-porn activism, and people have tried to draw me into that many times down the years. But I had my hands full for a very long time in the area that I was in, the legislation against prostitution. So I think if I were on that it focused in that particular area, I think you need to take Pornhub down first. And I believe you could well find yourself in a domino situation, and hopefully what OnlyFans being one of the dominoes.
Yeah, for sure. So we have about 2 more minutes, and I do want to get we have several more questions. We're not going to get to them all today, but um, there is a question, and I think this plays into some of the other things that you mentioned in the book. So, um, many of the schools, middle schools and so forth, knew about human trafficking, and many of the boys see so much abuse and negative treatment of girls and women in the video games that we play. How do we impact that? And so you also mentioned this um, in the book in different ways as well. So, for example, you use the example of the man who thought that women who were escorting were doing that because they enjoyed it and that they were selling their bodies because of their own free will, right? So we see that misconception in society. I've heard people say similar things as well. You talk about Victoria, Australia, and how female business professionals are forced to work in an atmosphere where there's male colleagues who conduct, out of their business meetings, and they go to strip clubs and so forth. I mean, that happened in my husband's former workplace, so it's these ways that our society are viewing women, or women that are being portrayed. And how do we how do we address that? How do female and male employees address situations like that? How do we combat these misconceptions? How do we teach our boys that what they're seeing in these video games is, you know, where I've heard in some of these video games, they actually get additional points, if they rape a woman on the video game.
Mm,
So
mm.
how do we address these toxic, I know which we kind of touched a little bit about, but some of these societal uh,
Well,
perceptions.
first of all, you can't keep on pumping a message into young, malleable, and currently forming minds and then be surprised when they pick up that ball and run with it. Like this just can't be surprising to people. Um, I think one of the things that I struggle with in my own trying to frame my own opinions even about what's happening in the American context is that while I have great respect for your freedom of speech constitutional amendment, I see the terrible harm that it's done in the area of pornography, because it was the First Amendment that allowed pornography um to keep on rolling despite the carnage that it had been proven to have caused in women's lives. Um, and I don't know how many of the people listening, or if yourself, Christine, will ever have read the documented evidence by Catherine McKinnon and Andrea Dworkin and the work that they did around pornography and how that was blocked on it was just steamrolled right over by the First Amendment. Catherine McKinnon wrote a very interesting book called Only Words that people might want to take a look at because it very carefully and eloquently lays out the argument for why pornography is not a matter of speech. I think sometimes, you need to just go right back to basics and get down and try to unpick at the roots, because this has turned into such a big ugly monster. You could be the rest of your life hacking at the twigs and the leaves, and you're going to have to unpick this from the ground up. I'd be very surprised if it happens in the next generation or two, to be honest with you, because there's so much work to be done. However, I fear that our grandchildren won't have a life, a world worth living in if we don't. I think that the work is that crucial. It is that urgent.
Yeah, definitely agree. Well, we are out of time, but I do want to. We didn't get to all the questions, unfortunately. Um, but I do want to get to one last question that I think is so important that I'd just like you to leave us with like a couple last minute words of what would you tell women who feel desperate or tempted by glamorization of this industry?
Oh my God. I would say, first of all, to the very young women and teenage girls, I'd say my heart goes all the way out to you. It's so heartbreaking to me to see what young women and girls are up against today because it's so many times harder than what we were up against in the 90s. Back then you had to be particularly vulnerable, like myself, in order to get drawn into this stuff. Now it can happen to any girl, anywhere, anytime. You are in no way protected, um, you know, by being middle class. Um, yes, you'll have the cushion of financial means. Um, However, that just doesn't give you anything like the protection that it used to do because it's only what 25, 30 years ago we had a situation where if you had even modest financial means, you were largely protected from this stuff. And now it can find its way into any home, anywhere, on the earth. All you need is an internet connection. It surpasses class politics. It's absolutely enormous. So I would my first thing that I would say to young women and girls would be you're immensely vulnerable, far more so than you know. The first step to protecting yourself is to understand how vulnerable you have been rendered. Um, and that's a difficult message maybe to get through to people because they can't compare the world they're living in to the one that existed before they were born. But I would say, please just trust me, you're exceptionally vulnerable. compared to people who lived a generation or two ago. So that would be my first message. My second would be that the glamorization of the sex trade in all of its forms is everywhere you look all the time. It's not at all like the world as it was, where you used to have to go looking for this stuff. Now it comes looking for you. That is how we flipped right the way around. Used to be that a man would have to go off to some, VCR store with a brown paper bag, and now it's landing up in your inbox, and it's everywhere you look. And I'm not just talking about raw, blatant pornography. I'm talking about in the imagery that you share with your friends, and the pornified poses that you've been indoctrinated to believe are actually perfectly normal. Where you're all sitting there pulling faces as if you're like halfway through given fellatio. That actually is not normal behavior, you know, but it's infiltrated into our lives, to the point where it's so very much around us all the time that we don't see it in the same way that a goldfish in a bowl does not see water. Now I say all that to a young woman or a girl, and she's just going to think that I'm some mad owl, you know, a loon who's just not tuned into reality. I would say to her, I'm very much tuned into reality, and I'm also tuned into how reality has changed so drastically and so quickly. And I see, it's like as if I can see landmines just plastered everywhere in front of her, but she's not yet equipped to see them for herself. So I suppose I'd end on, please, please listen to yourself, listen to your inner voice, because we can keep on proceeding with different circumstances and areas in our life where our inner self is screaming. And in the aftermath, you say to yourself, if only I'd listened. We've all had that conversation with ourselves. If only I'd listened to
Mhm.
myself, I guess I'd close on that. We all have inner guidance, and listen to your inner voice. It's rarely wrong, if ever.
Yeah, so true. So thank you so much. We are out of time. I wish we had more time. I had more questions, and I know our audience had more questions, but we really appreciate all your input, all your feedback. If you joined us today and haven't checked out the book, please do so. We'll be sending out a follow-up survey, and if we actually have a survey after this webinar, so please take just a couple minutes to fill that out. We will send out any resources or recording of this video of this webinar. We'll send that out in the next few days, and then feel free to share it with anyone that you know that might find this of interest. So Rachel, thank you so much for being brave and writing your book and sharing all your wisdom and knowledge with us on this issue. We really appreciate it, and thank you to all our attendees for joining us today.
Thanks so much, Christine. There's all little cute little hearts floating up the screen. So thanks
Yes.
everybody for those. Take care.
We did, yes, and I'm sorry we don't have any more time for any live questions, but we will, do our best to share this webinar with everyone. So feel free to check that out as we email it out. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye bye.